Chapter 7. Vronsky and Anna had been traveling for 3 months together in Europe. They had visited Venice, Rome, and Naples, and had arrived at a small Italian town where they meant to stay some time. A handsome head waiter, with thick pomaded hair parted from the neck upwards, an evening coat, a broad white cambric shirt front, and a bunch of trinkets hanging above his rounded stomach, stood with his hands in the full curve of his pockets, looking contemptuously from under his eyelids, while he gave some frigid reply to a gentleman who had stopped him. Catching the sound of footsteps coming from the other side of the entry towards a staircase, the head waiter turned round, and seeing the Russian count, who had taken their best rooms, he took his hands out of his pockets deferentially, and with a bow informed him that a courier had been, and that the business about the palazzo had been arranged. The steward was prepared to sign the agreement. "I'm glad to hear it," said Vronsky. "Is Madame at home or not?" "Madame has been out for a walk, but has returned now," answered the waiter. Vronsky took off his soft, wide-brimmed hat and passed his handkerchief over his heated brow and hair, which had grown half over his ears, and was brushing back, covering the bald patch on his head. Glancing casually at the gentleman, who still stood there gazing intently at him, he would have gone on. "This gentleman is a Russian, and was inquiring after you," said the head waiter, with mingled feelings of annoyance at never being able to get away from acquaintances anywhere, and longing to find some sort of diversion from the monotony of his life. Vronsky looked once more at the gentleman, who had retreated and stood still again, and at the same moment a light came into the eyes of both. "Golenishtchev, Vronsky." It really was Golenishtchev, a comrade of Vronsky's in the Corps of Pages. In the Corps, Golenishtchev had belonged to the Liberal party. He left the Corps without entering the army, and had never taken office under the government. Vronsky and he had gone completely different ways on leaving the Corps, and had only met once since. At that meeting, Vronsky perceived that Golenishtchev had taken up a sort of lofty, intellectually liberal line, and was consequently disposed to look down upon Vronsky's interest and calling in life. Hence, Vronsky had met him with the chilling and haughty manner he knew so well how to assume, the meaning of which was, "You may like or dislike my way of life. That's a matter of the most perfect indifference to me. You will have to treat me with respect if you want to know me." Golenishtchev had been contemptuously indifferent to the tone taken up by Vronsky. This second meeting might have been expected, one would have supposed, to estrange them still more. But now they beamed and exclaimed with delight on recognizing one another. Vronsky would never have expected to be so pleased to see Golenishtchev, but probably he was not himself aware how bored he was. He forgot the disagreeable impression of their last meeting, and with a farce of frank delight held out his hand to his old comrade. The same expression of delight replaced the look of uneasiness on Golenishtchev's face. "How glad I am to meet you," said Vronsky, showing his strong white teeth in a friendly smile. "I heard the name, Vronsky, but I didn't know which one. I'm very, very glad." "Let's go in. Come, tell me what you're doing." "I've been living here for 2 years. I'm working." "Ah," said Vronsky, "let's go in." And with the habit common with Russians, instead of saying in Russian what he wanted to keep from the servants, he began to speak in French. "Do you know Madame Karenina? We are traveling together. I'm going to see her now," he said in French, carefully scrutinizing Golenishtchev's face. "Ah, I did not know," though he did know, Golenishtchev answered carelessly. "Have you been here long?" he added. 4 days, Vronsky answered, once more scrutinizing his friend's face intently. Yes, he's a decent fellow, and he will look at the thing properly, Vronsky said to himself, catching the significance of Golenishtchev's face and the change of subject. I can introduce him to Anna. He looks at it properly. During those 3 months that Vronsky had been abroad with Anna, he had always, on meeting new people, asked himself how the new person would look at his relations with Anna, and for the most part, in men, he had met with the proper way of looking at it. But if he had been asked, and those who looked at it properly had been asked, exactly how they did look at it, both he and they would have been greatly puzzled to answer. In reality, those who in Vronsky's opinion had the proper view had no sort of view at all, but behaved in general as well-bred persons do behave in regard to all the complex and insoluble problems with which life is encompassed. They behaved with propriety, avoiding allusions and unpleasant questions. They assumed an air of fully comprehending the import and force of the situation, of accepting and even approving of it, but of considering it superfluous and uncalled for to put this into words. Vronsky at once divined that Golenishtchev was of this class, and therefore was doubly pleased to see him. And in fact, Golenishtchev's manner to Madame Karenina, when he was taken to call on her, was all that Vronsky could have desired. Without the slightest effort, he steered clear of all subjects which might lead to embarrassment. He had never met Anna before, and was struck by her beauty, and still more by the frankness with which she accepted her position. She blushed when Vronsky brought in Golenishtchev, and he was extremely charmed by this childish blush overspreading her candid and handsome face. But what he liked particularly was the way in which at once, as though on purpose that there might be no misunderstanding with an outsider, she called Vronsky simply Alexei, and said they were moving into a house they had just taken, which here was called a palazzo. Golenishtchev liked this direct and simple attitude to her own position. Looking at Anna's manner of simple-hearted, spirited gaiety, and knowing Alexei Alexandrovitch and Vronsky, Golenishtchev fancied that he understood her perfectly. He fancied that he understood what she was utterly unable to understand, how it was that, having made her husband wretched, having abandoned him and her son and lost her good name, she yet felt full of spirits, gaiety, and happiness. "It's in the guidebook," said Golenishtchev, referring to the palazzo Vronsky had taken. "There's a first-rate Tintoretto there, one of his latest period." "I tell you what, it's a lovely day. Let's go and have another look at it," said Vronsky, addressing Anna. "I shall be very glad to. I'll go and put on my hat. Would you say it's hot?" she said, stopping short in the doorway and looking inquiringly at Vronsky, and again a vivid flush overspread her face. Vronsky saw from her eyes that she did not know on what terms he cared to be with Golenishtchev, and so was afraid of not behaving as he would wish. He looked a long, tender look at her. "No, not very," he said. And it seemed to her that she understood everything, most of all that he was pleased with her, and smiling to him, she walked with her rapid step out at the door. The friends glanced at one another, and a look of hesitation came into both faces, as though Golenishtchev, unmistakably admiring her, would have liked to say something about her, and could not find the right thing to say, while Vronsky desired and dreaded his doing so. "Well then," Vronsky began to start a conversation of some sort. "You're settled here? You still look—" So you're settled here? You're still at the same work, then? He went on, recalling that he had been told Golenishtchev was writing something. Yes, I'm writing the second part of the Two Elements, said Golenishtchev, coloring with pleasure at the question. That is, to be exact, I am not writing it yet. I'm preparing, collecting materials. It will be a far wider scope and will touch on almost all questions. We in Russia refuse to see that we are the heirs of Byzantium. And he launched into a long and heated explanation of his views. Vronsky, at the first moment, felt embarrassed at not even knowing of the first part of the Two Elements, of which the author spoke as something well known. But as Golenishtchev began to lay down his opinions, and Vronsky was able to follow them without knowing the Two Elements, he listened to him with some interest, for Golenishtchev spoke well. But Vronsky was startled and annoyed by the nervous irascibility with which Golenishtchev talked of the subject that engrossed him. As he went on talking, his eyes glittered more and more angrily. He was more and more hurried in his replies to imaginary opponents, and his face grew more and more excited and worried. Remembering Golenishtchev, a thin, lively, good-natured, and well-bred boy, always at the head of the class, Vronsky could not make out the reason of his irritability, and he did not like it. What he particularly disliked was that Golenishtchev, a man belonging to a good set, should put himself on a level with some scribbling fellows with whom he was irritated and angry. Was it worth it? Vronsky disliked it, yet he felt that Golenishtchev was unhappy and was sorry for him. Unhappiness, almost mental derangement, was visible on his mobile, rather handsome face, while, without even noticing Anna's coming in, he went on hurriedly and hotly expressing his views. When Anna came in her hat and cape, and her lovely hand rapidly swinging her parasol, and stood beside him, it was with a feeling of relief that Vronsky broke away from the plaintive eyes of Golenishtchev, which had fastened persistently upon him, and with a fresh rush of love looked at his charming companion, full of life and happiness. Golenishtchev recovered himself with an effort, and at first was dejected and gloomy, but Anna, disposed to feel friendly with everyone as she was at that time, soon revived his spirits by her direct and lively manner. After trying various subjects of conversation, she got him upon painting, of which he talked very well, and she listened to him attentively. They walked to the house they had taken, and looked over it. I am very glad of one thing, said Anna to Golenishtchev when they were on their way back. Alexei will have a capital atelier. You must certainly take that room, she said to Vronsky in Russian, using the affectionately familiar form, as though she saw that Golenishtchev would become intimate with them in their isolation, and that there was no need of reserve before him. Do you paint? Said Golenishtchev, turning round quickly to Vronsky. Yes, I used to study long ago, and now I've begun to do a little, said Vronsky, reddening. He has great talent, said Anna with a delighted smile. I'm no judge, of course, but good judges have said the same. Chapter 8. Anna, in that first period of her emancipation and rapid return to health, felt herself unpardonably happy and full of the joy of life. The thought of her husband's unhappiness did not poison her happiness. On one side, that memory was too awful to be thought of. On the other side, her husband's unhappiness had given her too much happiness to be regretted. The memory of all that had happened after her illness, her reconciliation with her husband, its breakdown, the news of Vronsky's wound, his visit, the preparations for divorce, the departure from her husband's house, the parting from her son, all that seemed to her like a delirious dream from which she had waked up alone with Vronsky abroad. The thought of the harm caused to her husband aroused in her a feeling like repulsion, akin to what a drowning man might feel who has shaken off another man clinging to him. That man did drown. It was an evil action, of course, but it was the sole means of escape, and better not to brood over these fearful facts. One consoling reflection upon her conduct had occurred to her at the first moment of the final rupture, and when she now recalled all the past, she remembered that one reflection. I have inevitably made that man wretched, she thought, but I don't want to profit by his misery. I too am suffering and shall suffer. I am losing what I prized above everything. I am losing my good name and my son. I have done wrong, and so I don't want happiness. I don't want a divorce, and shall suffer from my shame and from the separation from my child. But however sincerely Anna had meant to suffer, she was not suffering. Shame there was not. With the tact of which both had such a large share, they had succeeded in avoiding Russian ladies abroad, and so had never placed themselves in a false position, and everywhere they had met people who pretended that they perfectly understood their position, far better indeed than they did themselves. Separation from the son she loved, even that did not cause her anguish in these early days. The baby girl, his child, was so sweet, and had so won Anna's heart, since she was all that was left her, that Anna rarely thought of her son. The desire for life, waxing stronger with recovered health, was so intense, and the conditions of life were so new and pleasant, that Anna felt unpardonably happy. The more she got to know Vronsky, the more she loved him. She loved him for himself and for his love for her. Her complete ownership of him was a continual joy to her. His presence was always sweet to her. All the traits of his character, which she learned to know better and better, were unutterably dear to her. His appearance, changed by his civilian dress, was fascinating to her, as though she were some young girl in love, and everything he said, thought, and did, she saw something unusually noble and elevated. Her adoration of him alarmed her indeed. She sought and could not find in him anything not fine. She dared not show him her sense of her own insignificance beside him. It seemed to her that, knowing this, he might sooner cease to love her, and she dreaded nothing now so much as losing his love, though she had no grounds for fearing it. But she could not help being grateful to him for his attitude to her, and showing that she appreciated it. He, who had in her opinion such a marked aptitude for a political career, in which he would have certainly played a leading part, he had sacrificed his ambition for her sake, and never betrayed the slightest regret. He was more lovingly respectful to her than ever, in the constant care that she should not feel the awkwardness of her position, never deserted him for a single instant. He, so manly a man, never opposed her, had indeed, with her, no will of his own, and was anxious, it seemed, for nothing but to anticipate her wishes. And she could not but appreciate this, even though the very intensity of his solicitude for her, the atmosphere of care with which he surrounded her, sometimes weighed upon her. Vronsky, meanwhile, in spite of the complete realization of what he had so long desired, was not perfectly happy. He soon felt that the realization of his desires gave him no more than a grain of sand out of the mountain of happiness he had expected. It showed him the mistake men make in picturing to themselves happiness as a realization of their desires. For a time after joining his life to hers and putting on civilian dress, he had felt all the delight of freedom in general, of which he had known nothing before, and of freedom in his love, and he was content, but not for long. He was soon aware that there was springing up in his heart a desire for desires. Without conscious intent, he began to clutch at every passing caprice, taking it for a desire and an object. 16 hours of the day must be occupied in some way, since they were living abroad in complete freedom, outside the conditions of social life which filled up time in Petersburg. As for the amusements of bachelor existence, which had provided Vronsky with entertainment on previous tours abroad, they could not be thought of, since the sole attempt of the sort had led to a sudden attack of depression in Anna, quite out of proportion with the cause, a late supper with bachelor friends. Relations with the society of the place, foreign and Russian, were equally out of the question, owing to the irregularity of their position. The inspection of objects of interest, apart from the fact that everything had been seen already, had not for Vronsky, a Russian and a sensible man, the immense significance Englishmen are able to attach to that pursuit. And just as the hungry stomach eagerly accepts every object it can get, hoping to find nourishment in it, Vronsky quite unconsciously clutched first at politics, then at new books, and then at pictures. As he had from a child a taste for painting, and as, not knowing what to spend his money on, he had begun collecting engravings, he came to a stop at painting, began to take interest in it, and concentrated upon it the unoccupied mass of desires which demanded satisfaction. He had a ready appreciation of art, and probably, with a taste for imitating art, he supposed himself to have the real thing essential for an artist, and after hesitating for some time which style of painting to select, religious, historical, realistic, or genre painting, he set to work to paint. But he had no conception of the possibility of knowing nothing at all of any school of painting, and of being inspired directly by what is in the soul, without caring whether what is painted will belong to any recognized school. Since he knew nothing of this, and drew his inspiration, not directly from life, but indirectly from life embodied in art, his inspiration came quickly and easily, and as quickly and easily came his success in painting something very similar to the sort of painting he was trying to imitate. More than any other style, he liked the French, graceful and effective, and in that style he began to paint Anna's portrait in Italian costume, and the portrait seemed to him, and to everyone who saw it, extremely successful. Chapter 9. The old neglected palazzo, with its lofty carved ceilings and frescoes on the wall, with its floors of mosaic, with its heavy yellow stuff curtains at the windows, with its vases on pedestals, and its open fireplaces, its carved doors and gloomy reception rooms, hung with pictures. This palazzo did much, by its very appearance after they moved into it, confirm in Vronsky the agreeable illusion that he was not so much a Russian country gentleman, a retired army officer, as an enlightened amateur and patron of the arts, himself a modest artist who had renounced the world, his connections, and his ambition for the sake of the woman he loved. The pose chosen by Vronsky, with their removal into the palazzo, was completely successful, and having, through Golenishev, made acquaintance with a few interesting people, for a time he was satisfied. He painted studies from nature under the guidance of an Italian professor of painting, and studied medieval Italian life. Medieval Italian life so fascinated Vronsky that he even wore a hat and flung a cloak over his shoulder in the medieval style, which, indeed, was extremely becoming to him. "Here we live and know nothing of what's going on," Vronsky said to Golenishev as he came to see him one morning. "Have you seen Mihailov's picture?" he said, handing him a Russian gazette he had received that morning, and pointing to an article on a Russian artist living in the very same town, and just finishing a picture which had long been talked about and had been bought beforehand. The article reproached the government and the Academy for letting so remarkable an artist be left without encouragement and support. "I've seen it," answered Golenishev. "Of course, he's not without talent, but it's all in the wrong direction. It's all the Ivanov Strauss-Renan attitude to Christ and to religious painting." "What is the subject of the picture?" asked Anna. "Christ before Pilate. Christ is represented as a Jew with all the realism of the new school." In the question of the subject of the picture having brought him to one of his favorite theories, Golenishev launched forth into a lecture on it. "I can't understand how they fall into such a gross mistake. Christ always has his definite embodiment in the art of the great masters, and therefore, if they want to depict not God, but a revolutionist or a sage, let them take from history a Socrates, a Franklin, but not Christ. They take the very figure which cannot be taken for their art, and then—" "And is it true that this Mihailov is in poverty?" asked Vronsky, thinking that, as a Russian Maecenas, it was his duty to assist the artist whether the picture was good or bad. "I should say not. He's a remarkable portrait painter, but I believe he doesn't care about painting any more portraits, so very likely he is in want. I maintain that—" "Couldn't we ask him to paint a portrait of Anna Arkadyevna?" said Vronsky. "Why mine?" said Anna. "After yours, I don't want another portrait. Better have one done of Annie," so she called her baby girl. "Here she is," she added, looking out of the window at the handsome Italian nurse who was carrying the child out into the garden, and immediately glancing unnoticed at Vronsky. The handsome nurse, from whom Vronsky was painting a head for his picture, was the one hidden grief in Anna's life. He painted with her as his model, admired her beauty and medievalism, and Anna dared not confess to herself that she was afraid of becoming jealous of this nurse, and was for that reason particularly gracious and condescending both to her and her little son. Vronsky, too, glanced out of the window and into Anna's eyes, and turning at once to Golenishev, he said, "Do you know this artist?" "I have met him, but he's an odd fish, quite without breeding. You know, one of those uncouth new people one's so often coming across these days, one of those free-thinkers, you know, who are reared in theories of atheism, skepticism, and materialism." "In former days," said Golenishev, not observing nor willing to observe that both Anna and Vronsky wanted to speak, "in former days, the free thinker was a man who had been brought up in ideas of religion, law, and morality. But now there has sprung up a new type of born freethinkers who grow up without even having heard of principles of morality or religion, of the existence of authorities, who grow up directly in ideas of negation of everything, that is to say, savages. Well, he's of that class. He's the son, it appears, of some Moscow butler, and has never had any sort of bringing up. When he got into the academy and made his reputation, he tried, as he's no fool, to educate himself, and he turned to what seemed to him the very source of culture, the magazine. In old times, you see, a man who wanted to educate himself, a Frenchman, for instance, would have set to work to study all the classics and theologians and historians and philosophers, and, all the intellectual work that came in his way. But in our day, he goes straight for the literature of negation, very quickly assimilates all the extracts of the science of negation, and he's ready. And that's not all. 20 years ago, he would have found in that literature traces of conflict with authorities, with the creeds of the ages. He would have perceived from this conflict that there was something else. But now he comes at once upon a literature in which the old creeds do not even furnish matter for discussion, but it is stated baldly that there is nothing else. Evolution, natural selection, struggle for existence, and that's all. In my article, I'll tell you what, said Anna, who had for a long while been exchanging wary glances with Vronsky, and knew that he was not in the least interested in the education of the artist, but was simply absorbed by the idea of assisting him in ordering a portrait from him. I tell you what, she said, resolutely interrupting Golenishev, who was still talking away. Let's go see him. Golenishev recovered his self-possession and readily agreed. But as the artist lived in a remote suburb, it was decided to take the carriage. An hour later, Anna, with Golenishev by her side and Vronsky on the front seat of the carriage facing them, drove up to a new ugly house in the remote suburb. On learning from the porter's wife, who came out to them, that Mihailov saw visitors at his studio, but that at that moment he was in his lodging, only a couple of steps off, they sent her to him with their cards, asking permission to see his picture.